It just makes it heavier and harder to use. Axes are heavier enough, so adding another axe head on the back, which is just doing nothing, is ridiculous. In fact, it's pretty stupid.
Whoa, easy there, bro. I think you need to relax.
Adding another axe head on the back, which is just doing nothing.
Just one question. Why you hate polearms? Double axes have gotten a lot of hate from history enthusiasts. What they've all overlooked is one very important thing. In Heroes of Might and Magic 3, the Minotaurs start out with spiked axes, and then they're upgraded to Minotaur kings with double axes. Checkmate, self-righteous skeptics. Your argument is invalid. Alright, I'm joking, of course. I mostly agree with Shad. I just have a few things to add and nitpick here and there. So first I'm going to discuss the pros and cons of double-headed axes in terms of practicality of the design. And then we're going to look at historical examples in a separate video, part 2. I don't want to make this too long. So first off, double axes are obviously very iconic, and not just in modern fantasy, but in fact in history as well. They had plenty of symbolic value. The Minoan double axes, again, we'll see that later. The Minoans did have double-bitted axes as tools as well, which look different, but they have plenty of ceremonial forms, which were used in religious contexts. You can see right here. So in the hands of Minotaurs, this makes perfect sense. You know, Minotaurs being a Greek mythological creature and these having symbolic value from the same culture, albeit earlier, makes perfect sense.
Because axes are heavy, you can use them easier by separating your hands far more so.
Oh, did you mean balance? Well, yes, they're top heavy. That's kind of the point. That's why they're the chat of weapons. Heavy is really not the right word. There are plenty of axes that are very thin, like the disdain axe. It's in fact thin enough to practically disappear. It's a neat trick, isn't it? So, not heavy at all, by any means. But there are so many different types, so many different forms and iterations. Just for a couple of examples, here's an axe from India with an apparently huge blade. You'd think this is heavy, right? But not actually. This weighs 822 grams or 1.8 pounds. That's pretty light in my book. Then we've got a bardiche, again pretty large, 1.5 kilograms, a bit over 3 pounds. Again, not a problem. Then we've got a particularly humongous bardiche right here. And there's easily enough material for 2 blades. You know, if you wanted to preserve the same weight, but make 2 smaller blades out of it, you absolutely could. Ironically, this processional axe from India, in other words, something that's not even made for combat, weighs less, 1.16 kilograms or about 2.5 pounds. That's less than my Dane axe, which weighs 1.6 kilograms or 2.86 pounds. The thing is, you can tweak blades in all kinds of ways, the same as with swords. You can make them thicker, thinner, narrower, wider, whatever you want really. If you take the same amount of iron or steel, you can produce very different shapes. And just like with swords, thinner axe blades that taper more, cut better, thicker ones are more durable. When I was young and extra edgy, I used to have a gargantuan double axe. This was back in 2003, almost 20 years ago. Ancient times. This thing was completely ridiculous, utterly useless, way too large, too thick, too heavy, clunky, not well designed. It just looked cool, and because I was young and edgy, that kind of drew me in, suckered me in, you could say. But at the same time, I also had a smaller, much more sensical double axe, which was not heavy at all. It had two relatively small blades, and there was really nothing wrong with it. Well, okay, there was one thing wrong with it, round handle. I didn't realize that at the time, but other than that, just the blade itself was fine. Nothing wrong with the handling either. You could make the argument that it being symmetrical with two identical blades on each side, that kind of helps with some swings, at least certain angles, kind of balances it out more. In practical terms, I haven't handled that many double axes, but a few, and I would say, yeah, the difference is noticeable, but I wouldn't say it's so dramatic that one or the other is ultimately better in every regard, in every situation. One thing that double axes are noticeably good at is throwing, because you basically get twice the chance to make it stick. And this is also where you most commonly see double-bitted axes nowadays. It's usually either for throwing or as a forest axe. Some people really like the double-bitted axes. They like how they handle and perform, and they like to have that extra edge. And that's really the main argument in favor of it. You have two edges. So if one dulls, you can use the other.
Now you might say, well, what if the actual front axe gets blunted? That was what seems to have justified actual double-bitted wood-cutting axe. The blade of a combat axe is coming in less contact with stuff than the blade of a wood-cutting axe. A wood-cutting axe, you are chopping and chopping and chopping and chopping and chopping. Like, even in battle, the axe head is going to come in contact with your targets far less.
Well, yes, a battle axe will hit targets less often on average than a felling axe, no doubt about it. But let's not forget about what things they hit. Sure, chopping wood will take its toll on a blade, particularly with improper technique. But what about steel? What about armor? What about enemy weapons? I mean, let's just take a look at this Dane axe right here. This thing has seen some definite use. And if you had a second one, you could flip it around and use it that way. The other one, well, you can still hit things with, obviously. Even if it's this messed up, it's still going to do something. Although the gouges are so large that you'll have to worry about basically the same effect as with the silly, exaggerated, huge serrations on fantasy axes, where as you strike something, clothing will most likely bunch up and get caught in between and snag and probably stop or at least slow it down. So far I'm probably sounding like I'm trying to totally vindicate double axes. No, not really. Like I said earlier, I do generally agree with Shad on this. I would personally, if I had to choose, I would rather have an axe with a spike or a hammer at the end than another blade, particularly if it's identical. But there's one scenario where I can see merit in a double axe, and that is if you have two different edges. So, for example, if one side is more strongly tapered, this axe here is a good example. It's pretty thick, but then throughout this entire length, it thins out substantially. And thinning the wedge this much gives quite a significant mechanical advantage. This one is also quite sharp. And the same way as with swords, a sharp edge may help against padded armor. If you think about the tests I've done in older videos, sharpness made a huge difference, made all the difference between just scratching up a sturdy gambeson and slicing it right open. So with an axe, of course, since it is top heavy and since there's plenty of mass, if you strike somebody hard, it's going to hurt them. At the same time, what a padded jack or gambeson is particularly good at is absorbing blunt impact force. With a sharp one, it is probably going to tear right through the fabric layers and go into your body as opposed to just giving you the blunt impact. So you could have one side that's like this, pretty strongly tapered, very, finely ground edge, nice shaving sharp. So you could use this against padded armor, for example, or soft targets. And then another side that has a, less acute angle, kind of a sturdier grind. If you are not that familiar with blade geometry and grinds and everything, I've made a video about that, or even two, which I'll link down below for reference if you need it. So the other one could be better for chopping into hard materials. This is also part of the idea with double-bitted forest axes. Some people like to use them because, for example, if they encounter a nasty knot in a piece of wood that could potentially damage the edge, they'll flip it around and use the more robust one, or simply the somewhat more dull side, or more chewed up, whatever. So they preserve the other one. So then you have two different edges for different purposes, and that can potentially be quite useful. The second edge doesn't have to be dull or blunt. Sturdy doesn't mean that. In fact, you can have a nice, thick, robust blade with a relatively obtuse angle, but you can still hone the apex of the edge to the point where you can shave hair with it as well. That can even be done with chisels. Now in history, axes with spikes or hammers are abundant. You find plenty of examples. And I would agree that's more useful. The versatility of an extra tool, something that performs a different function, makes more sense than going with the same thing all over again. Also, you could have differently shaped blades. Now, something like this is a double axe. It's just not a twin axe, I suppose you could say. Again, more about specific examples in part 2. And a different angle could also be useful, depending on what you need to do at the time. For example, whether the target is higher or lower. If it's a lower target, you could benefit from an axe blade that's tilted downward, whereas one that's tilted upward has different purposes. You could potentially thrust with the horn of the axe, things like that. If you think about it, to someone from a culture that uses exclusively single-edged swords, even a double-edged sword may seem kind of odd at first. They might be like, why would you spend the extra time to grind another edge on there? When are you going to use that, right? Yeah, most of the time you are going to use your primary edge, but there are situations where you could use the other one. Use your imagination for a moment and in your head mirror this. So imagine both sides are like that. So let's say I'm cutting down, following through, and then I come back down on the other side. In this case, this works just fine. You can strike with a spike, but you just have that extra option. Yeah, sure, you can bash someone with the other end if there's nothing there, but if you do have a blade, it's a little bit more effective, potentially. Or, again, a hammer. Another thing that comes to mind is parrying with the axe head. You can, on just about any axe, you can catch an opponent's weapon like this on top here. If you imagine you've got two like that, particularly if it's fairly strongly swept upward, this is suddenly getting a lot more effective because now you're also trapping it in between the two horns of the two blades, basically. Again, before you think that I'm trying too much to defend double axes, I agree with the main issues here, that there are better ways to use the same material. Instead of hammering the steel into another blade, you could shape it into a hammer or a spike, and you would have more versatility with it that way. And there are other drawbacks, like it being awkward to carry. If you have two blades sticking out, you can very well just stick the blade in your belt. With a smaller hand axe in particular, you can just tuck it in your belt and it's not going to bother you that much. At the same time, a Dane axe is also not exactly something that you would carry on your back easily or anything like that. So some weapons just are inconvenient to carry. It is what it is. And they could also be potentially more difficult to make, or at least more time consuming, because you're shaping and grinding 2 blades instead of 1. If you have something like this Igorot axe here, which by the way is one of my absolute favorite axe designs, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. This here, not so much, because this is still one piece. It's got a tang actually, which is riveted here. So you don't even have to worry about how you make the eye of the axe. With some axes, the way it's done is you forge out a longer piece and you basically wrap it around and then you weld it. That's a fairly easy way to shape the eye of an axe so you can heft it. You can't do that with a double axe, I think. I'm not a blacksmith, but again, depending on the construction, in this case, it doesn't matter at all. And as said, this is an absolutely ludicrously devastating weapon. And in fact, theoretically, you could argue that this is a double-bladed axe, because this is not actually a spike. It's not round, and at the end, it's kind of like a sharpened screwdriver bit, you know? So the edge is actually perpendicular, like this. So this is an edged blade. It's just an extremely narrow one. So if you wanted to nitpick or you know, be pedantic about it, you could call this a double axe. It doesn't really fall under that category, you know, the way people normally understand it, but hey. And again, this is very useful because you have 2 different tools. This is a great example of a multi-purpose weapon. It doesn't have a spike on top, but otherwise definitely a number of functions. And this is why I decided to split this into 2 parts, because this video is already pretty long by my standards, and I like to keep it short-ish, sweet-ish, you know what I mean, sweet and sour, whatever, salty, whatever you like. Thanks for watching. Hope you liked it, and watch out for part 2. As soon as that's published, I'll put the link down below in the description and probably also in a pinned comment. So yeah, have a good one, folks. See you then.